Thanks, Lisa. Hi, I'm Megan Dunn. I'm a QA chemist with EPA Region 10 out of the Seattle office. So, um, with grant season underway, we figured it's a good time to check in and see what questions people may have while they're putting quality assurance project plans together. While we switch gears here from hearing the wonderful lightning talks, I'll put just a few frequently asked questions up. Thank you. So one question, I think it's just a little it's not super difficult, but I think it can be hard to wrap your brain around at times. So we'll just go through what is a QAPP requirement for secondary data or non-direct measurements. So first of all, what is this even? So this would be data that you're collecting for your project. It's not a sample that you are collecting or data that you are directly generating as part of this project. It could be data you're pulling from other databases, information from the literature, published literature, historical data for an area. And so this, since this data is still going to be used to inform your project, it's worth considering the quality of the data, the use of the data, and what sort of scrutiny you might want to put the data through yourself to make sure it's acceptable for use for your project. So basically, it's that's what you would want to describe in the QA plan in the appropriate section where it asks for the non-direct measurement information. Describe what the intended use of this data from, what's the data source, is there any acceptance criteria? So I've included some examples. So one example, data from XYZ database will be used. Outliers indicated in the database will be excluded. So the level of scrutiny would be if this reputable source that we're collecting our data from has excluded certain data or called it an outlier, we are also going to exclude that data. Another sort of simple example would be daily local precipitation amounts. If that's needed for your project for some reason, and you are not going to yourself measure the daily local precipitation amounts, you obtain it from, say, the Weather Service. That would be something to just document and mention in the QAPP. So this is one to really keep in mind, the graded approach, as they say, for quality assurance project plans. The guidance is written very broadly to cover any sort of project that might come through EPA, from very large and strict in a regulatory sense to maybe a more educational or informational project. So keep that in mind, that just that level of scrutiny that your project may require. It may not be very much. Of course, you want to use reputable sources. This is just a way to briefly document that in your QA plan. Next slide. And then, yeah, I sort of got into the graded approach, but another section, the data review, verification, and validation. This can really vary from project to project. So if you're looking at laboratory data, I guess keep in mind who will be doing that review of the data. Will there be some formal validation of the data that is occurring beyond the laboratory? Is that required for the level of project that's happening? These are questions to sort of keep in mind while you're pulling your QA plan together. Again, the graded approach. So if your project may not require a huge amount of scrutiny and very standardized process of reviewing the data, or your project might. It really depends on what the scope of the project is and what the intended use of the data is, if that makes sense. Okay, so I want to open it up to questions. Do folks have any questions while they're writing their quality plans, or any nagging questions if you've already written one, but something is not sitting well? I also saw some mention in Slido of SOPs for sampling fish tissue, maybe. So I know that was a past concern for QA. If folks want to talk about that, this is part of, certainly falls under the umbrella of this Q&A portion.
I see. Yeah, David Brooks posed that question, Megan. Are people willing to share their SOPs for collecting samples of water and fish tissue? And we have seen an interest in the previous meetings asking, what do you want? What kind of help do people want? And that has come up, David. We haven't figured out a nice, elegant way to share to answer that question. One of the ways that we're hoping to, though, is as projects that are funded through the restoration program grant cycle produce a QAPP that specifies methods. If you're willing to let us pull that method information from your QAPP, us being this core team staff work behind the scenes I mentioned earlier, we're thinking we could build a way to share that information across partners. Not to discourage anybody from doing it right now if you're trying to build a QAPP, because we don't have a solution yet, but we are thinking about how to meet that interest and demand for coordination. So yeah, stay tuned, or just send your thing right to David right now. But David, know that we are trying to figure out a clean, elegant way to share that information.
Yeah, I actually was just reposting that question in my response because somebody else asked it, and I was offering that I'm happy to share essentially the QAPP that we've done that includes sort of the SOP for fish tissue and water quality sampling. And so I put my email in there. If people want the one that we've developed, I'm happy to share it. But maybe a place to house all of those would be of interest.
Right. I think a short-term solution could be that if people are willing to allow us to post the QAPP, you could, I don't know, redact information if there's something in there you didn't want to share. We could post those documents in a public way. We could post them in a more controlled way in Teams, but it's a little harder for people. Some agencies have restrictions about Teams. So that would be the simple thing, but we're kind of trying to envision, I don't know if we want to call it a library of SOPs, but I think that certainly is of interest. We're just trying to figure out, what does that look like mechanically and how to keep it alive and fresh. So yeah. Maybe Amy, this is a core team. It's a thing for us to query everyone after the meeting.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, and I want to point out one resource that's available. There's EPA's emergency response team has a whole bunch of field SOPs available. I can put the link to it. I see there is a fish sampling and processing SOP, and I haven't looked through it. So depending on what kind of equipment that references, there's a huge repository though on this website that I'll share with SOPs. So when I see someone mention ecology as publicly available SOPs as well.
Yeah, Megan, if you want to throw those links in the Slido, we'll be sure to include those in the notes when we follow up on this meeting.
And someone just asked about slides, and yes, we will share slides. Any other questions or feedback? For those of you who are almost done or done with your QAPP, do you have advice for your friends and colleagues here on the call who might not have finished their QAPP? You have Megan on your speed dial?
Right, reach out anytime if you think of something later.
And thanks. I see the link now from Megan in the Slido for EPA's some SOPs from EPA.
All right, thanks everybody.
Well, thank you, Megan. All right.